The white police officer didn't stand. The moment the judge walked into the courtroom, every other person, lawyers, journalists, defendants, and even the bailiff, rose in quiet, practiced respect. But not him. He leaned back in his chair, legs stretched, arms crossed, a slow smirk curling at the edge of his lips. The arrogance dripped from his posture, his expression, his very existence in that room. He wasn't just refusing to stand, he was making a statement. She stopped at the bench, her black robe flowing behind her, and locked eyes with him. Silence pressed heavy against the walls. The tension was suffocating. "You will stand when I enter this courtroom." Her voice was calm, steady, authoritative. His smirk widened. He gave her a once-over, his gaze dripping with condescension, with the kind of deep-rooted entitlement that had been planted centuries before either of them were born. He barely shook his head. "Respect is earned," he muttered, just loud enough for the words to slice through the courtroom like a knife. "Not given." Murmurs broke out among the observers. The attorneys exchanged glances. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Everyone in that room knew what was happening, knew why he refused to rise. It wasn't about protocol. It wasn't about court etiquette. It was about power. It was about control. It was about the fact that the person sitting behind the bench was a black woman, and he, a white man in uniform, didn't believe she deserved his respect. She didn't flinch. She didn't break eye contact. She didn't let the sharp sting of humiliation show, though it was there, pressing against her ribcage, burning in her gut, screaming in the back of her mind. How many times? How many times had she walked into rooms where men like him assumed she didn't belong? How many times had she been underestimated, undermined, dismissed, all because of the color of her skin? "You are in my courtroom," she said, her voice cutting through the whispers, the weight of her authority undeniable. "And in my courtroom, you will stand when the judge enters." His smirk didn't falter. "Guess we have a problem, then," he said, leaning back even further, challenging her, daring her to react. The audacity. The sheer, blatant audacity. She could have ordered the bailiff to force him up. She could have held him in contempt. She could have thrown him out of the courtroom. But she didn't. She simply inhaled slowly, deeply, and said, "Noted." And then she sat down. The case continued, the minutes crawling by, but the room still buzzed with unspoken words, with the aftershock of what had just happened. The news spread like wildfire. The media pounced on it. A white police officer openly disrespecting a black judge in her own courtroom. The headlines wrote themselves. Commentators dissected it. Social media exploded. Some called it an act of resistance. Others called it what it was, racism, plain and simple. But for her, it wasn't just another headline. It wasn't just another moment in the never-ending cycle of public outrage. It was personal. Days later, as she sat in her office, a file landed on her desk. A cold case. A case that had been buried, forgotten, intentionally ignored. A black teenager, unarmed, shot and killed during a routine stop years ago. The officer involved. The same man who had refused to stand in her courtroom. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the folder. A slow exhale escaped her lips. The past had a way of resurfacing. Justice had a way of finding its moment. He thought he had one. He thought his authority, his privilege, his badge made him untouchable. But what happens when the scales finally tip? When power shifts? When the people you once dismissed, once humiliated, once looked down upon, rise? He refused to stand for justice. Now, justice was coming for him. And this time, he'd have no choice but to rise. Hey, family. Before we start, let's be clear, Plow of Twist stands against racism in all forms. This story is about justice, resilience, and fighting back against discrimination. If you've ever felt unheard, overlooked, or disrespected because of your skin color, know that you are powerful, you are worthy, and you belong. This one is for you. Enjoy the story, and if you support the message, hit that subscribe button and stay with us. Let's keep pushing for change. Now, let's dive in. The weight of the gavel in her hand had always been something Judge Naomi Carter carried with ease, a symbol of the authority she had fought her entire life to earn. But today, as she sat in the solitude of her chambers, that same gavel felt heavier than ever before, as if the weight of everything it represented pressed down on her shoulders, forcing her to reckon with something she could not yet name. It was not just the exhaustion of another long day in court. It was not just the endless parade of cases that blurred together in a cycle of crime, punishment, and justice that often felt elusive. It was something deeper, something more personal. It was the sting of what had happened in that courtroom, the sharp humiliation that still burned, the reminder that no matter how high she climbed, how many degrees hung on her wall, how many cases she presided over, there would always be men like him, men who would never truly see her as their equal. The moment replayed over and over in her mind, a loop she could not turn off, a wound that refused to close. The way he had leaned back in his chair, his legs stretched out, his arms crossed, that smug smirk plastered across his face as if he was amused by the entire situation. He had made his choice in that instant, made it clear that he would rather disrespect the authority of the court than acknowledge that a black woman sat behind that bench, wielding the power that men like him had spent generations hoarding for themselves. She had seen defiance before, seen anger, resentment, even open hostility in her courtroom, but this was different. This was deliberate. Calculated. A statement made without words. She had stood there for a moment, her presence demanding respect, her voice calm but firm as she issued the command, "You will stand when I enter this courtroom." It was not a request. It was not a plea. It was an order, one backed by the law, by protocol, by every rule that governed the space they both occupied. But Mark Calloway had only smirked deeper, his gaze dripping with condescension as he let the silence stretch long enough to make his defiance clear. And then, with deliberate slowness, he had spoken words that still rang in her ears, words that had burrowed under her skin like a slow poison. Respect is earned, not given. The reaction had been immediate. A low murmur had spread through the courtroom like a shockwave, eyes darting between her and the man who dared to challenge her authority so openly. The attorneys had stiffened in their seats, uncertain whether to intervene or simply witness the moment unfold. The journalists in the gallery had leaned forward instinctively, sensing the kind of headline that wrote itself. Even the bailiff, a man who had worked with Naomi for years, had shifted uncomfortably, torn between his duty to enforce order and the knowledge that this was something bigger than a simple act of disrespect. Naomi had kept her face neutral, years of discipline allowing her to mask the storm that raged beneath her skin. She had learned long ago that to show anger, to allow herself even a flicker of visible frustration, would only be used against her. The world watched women like her differently, judged them more harshly, waited for them to break so they could say they had never belonged in the first place. So she had simply inhaled, slow and measured, and met his gaze with a stare that did not waver. "You are in my courtroom," she had said, her voice steady, unwavering, every syllable slicing through the thick, suffocating air like a blade. "And in my courtroom, you will stand when the judge enters." But Calloway had not moved. He had only leaned back further, his posture dripping with arrogance, with the certainty of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Guess we have a problem, then," he had muttered, as if the very idea of following her order was beneath him, as if the concept of standing for a black woman, a black judge, was something his body refused to allow. She could have reacted. She could have ordered the bailiff to remove him, could have held him in contempt, could have flexed the power that came with her position and made an example out of him right then and there. But she didn't. Instead, she simply said, "Noted," and took her seat. And the case had moved forward, the courtroom slowly returning to the routine of legal proceedings, but the tension never dissipating, the moment lingering like an unspoken storm hanging in the air. But the moment did not end when she left the courtroom. It followed her home. It followed her into the quiet of her office, into the reflection she saw in the mirror, into the memories she could never quite erase. She had spent her life fighting to be seen, to be respected, to be valued in spaces that had never been designed for people like her. And Calloway had reminded her, in the cruelest way possible, that in his eyes, in the eyes of men like him, she would always be someone who did not deserve what she had earned. Calloway. She had known men like him her entire life. The ones who carried themselves as if the world had been built for them, as if their authority was something that could never be questioned. He had been a cop for over 2 decades, the kind who wore his badge like armor, who spoke about the good old days of policing when officers weren't afraid to use force, when people knew their place. He was the kind of man who never had to second-guess his actions, who had been protected by a system that saw men like him as necessary, even when their hands were stained with injustice. The complaints against him were there, if you knew where to look. Excessive force allegations. Reports of racial profiling. A history of targeting black men, of making arrests that never quite held up under scrutiny but had been waved away by a department that saw him as one of their best. The kind of cop who got away with things because his superiors wanted to keep him on the force, because his reputation among other officers made him untouchable. And yet, here he was, in her courtroom, making it clear that he had no respect for her authority. No respect for the position she had worked her entire life to attain. No respect for her, period. She had tried to move on, to push the moment out of her mind, to remind herself that men like him did not get to decide her worth. But then, just days later, a file had landed on her desk. A cold case, one that had been buried, forgotten, dismissed without a second thought. A black teenager, 17 years old, unarmed, killed by an officer who had claimed he feared for his life. The officer involved? Mark Calloway. Naomi's hands had tightened around the folder, her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the details. It was the same story she had seen play out too many times before. A young black boy, stopped for matching the description of a suspect. A confrontation that should have never escalated. A life taken too soon. No charges filed. Case closed. She sat back in her chair, her heart pounding. Calloway had spent years walking free, untouchable, believing himself immune from consequences. He thought the law worked for him, not against him. He thought his badge, his reputation, his privilege would always protect him. But the past had a way of resurfacing. Justice had a way of finding its moment. And Naomi Carter was about to make sure that, for the first time in his life, Mark Calloway would learn what it meant to be held accountable. The room felt colder than usual, though Naomi knew the temperature hadn't changed. It was the weight of it all, the gravity of what was unfolding in front of her. The past had come knocking, and it had come carrying the name Mark Calloway. She sat at her desk, the cold case file spread open in front of her, every page a scream for justice that had never come. 17 years old. Shot and killed. No weapon found. No real justification. Another black boy turned into a statistic, another life stolen with the simple excuse of, he looked like a threat. How many times had she seen it? How many mothers had sat in courtrooms just like hers, staring at the man who killed their child, knowing deep down there would be no justice? How many families had been told to move on, to trust the system, when the system had never been designed to protect them in the first place? And now, fate had dropped this case at her feet, handed it to her as if daring her to do something with it. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another tragedy. This was personal. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay composed. She had always been good at that, staying composed. Years of practice, of being the only black woman in rooms full of men who expected her to fail, had made sure of that. But as she flipped through the pages, as she read the officer's statement, Calloway's statement, she could feel the fire building in her chest, slow and simmering, growing hotter with every word. There was a knock at her door. Lisa stepped in, her face tense. She had been with Naomi for years, had seen her handle high-profile cases, had watched her navigate courtrooms filled with men who thought they were above the law. But this was different. Even Lisa could feel it. "You all right?" Lisa asked, her voice careful, as if afraid to break whatever trance Naomi was in. Naomi exhaled through her nose, shutting the file. She couldn't sit in this office and drown in anger. She needed facts. She needed to know. "I need everything on this case," she said, standing. "The original reports. The witness statements. The internal investigation records. Whatever you can find, get it to me." Lisa hesitated. "You sure about this?" Naomi met her eyes. "I'm not sure about anything right now. But I know I can't let this go." Lisa nodded. "I'll get on it." As soon as the door shut behind her, Naomi grabbed her coat and left her office. She needed answers, and she knew exactly where to start. The police department was a fortress. It always had been. A place designed to protect its own, built to shield men like Calloway from scrutiny, from consequences. Naomi had spent enough years as a defense attorney to know how these walls operated. But today, she wasn't here as a lawyer. Today, she was here as a judge. She walked through the glass doors, her heels clicking against the polished floors, her presence immediately drawing eyes. Some of the officers recognized her. Some didn't. But the tension in the air was palpable. At the front desk, a young officer glanced up, clearly caught off guard. Judge Carter. What brings you here?" "I need to speak with Captain Reynolds," she said, voice steady. "Now." The officer hesitated before grabbing the phone, murmuring into the receiver. Naomi folded her arms, her patience thinning by the second. Minutes later, a door swung open, and Captain Reynolds appeared. He was an older man, thick-set, his gray mustache twitching as he took in the sight of her standing in the middle of his precinct. He forced a smile, but she could see the discomfort in his eyes. "Judge Carter. This is unexpected. I need to see the files on the Anthony Green case," she said. "The original ones. Not the cleaned-up version that made it to the public." Reynolds's smile faltered. "That case was closed years ago." "I know. And now it's open again." A flicker of something, nervousness, maybe, crossed his face. "May I ask why?" She didn't blink. "Because I said so." He let out a tight breath, rubbing a hand over his chin. "Look, Judge. That case was ruled justified. There were no witnesses, no evidence to contradict the officer's statement." "Calloway's statement," she corrected. Reynolds gave a slow nod. "Yes. Calloway's statement." She stared at him, unblinking. "And you believed him?" There was a long silence. And then, finally, Reynolds exhaled, stepping aside. "Come with me." He led her through the precinct, past rows of desks, past officers who pretended not to watch her. Naomi felt every set of eyes on her, every glance filled with a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and unease. Finally, they reached the archives. Reynolds punched in a code, the heavy metal door unlocking with a soft click. "This is everything we have," he said, motioning toward the shelves lined with old files. "But I have to warn you, Judge. You dig too deep into old cases like this, you might not like what you find." Naomi's lips barely curled. "I already don't like what I've found." She stepped inside. And as the door shut behind her, as she reached for the file marked Anthony Green, she knew, she was about to uncover something bigger than she had ever imagined. Later that night, in the dim glow of her office, Naomi sat surrounded by stacks of reports, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped through page after page. And then, she found it. A witness statement. A statement that had never made it into the final report. Her heart pounded as she read it. "I saw the whole thing. The kid wasn't doing anything. He had his hands up. He was scared. The officer shot him anyway. And then he told me to keep my mouth shut, or I'd be next. A witness. Someone had seen everything. And that someone had been silenced. Naomi felt her pulse in her throat. This wasn't just a case of wrong place, wrong time. This was murder. This was a cover-up. And Calloway had walked away from it. For years, he had lived his life, worn his badge, paraded around like a hero while a teenage boy's name had been reduced to a forgotten case file. Her breath was slow, measured, but her hands clenched into fists. This changes everything. Because now, she had proof. And the moment she stepped into that courtroom again, Calloway was going to realize, his past had finally caught up to him. The courtroom was packed. Every seat was taken, every inch of space along the walls filled with journalists, activists, off-duty officers, and silent observers who had come to witness something they never thought they would see. The air was thick, humming with tension, charged with the weight of a moment that had been building for years. Naomi Carter sat behind the bench, poised, composed, a storm behind her eyes. Across from her, Mark Calloway sat at the defendant's table, his usual arrogance subdued, his jaw tight, his fingers clasped together on the desk. He hadn't expected to be here. A man like him never did. The system had always worked in his favor. But today, something was different. Today, he wasn't in control. The bailiff's voice cut through the heavy silence. Case number 2015-789, the state versus Mark Calloway, charges of obstruction of justice, perjury, and murder in the first degree. Murder. The word landed like a thunderclap in the room. It wasn't the kind of charge that officers like Calloway faced, not in a courtroom, not with a judge staring him down like she could see straight through his skin to the rot beneath. He shifted slightly in his chair but kept his face blank. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Rachel Lawson, stood and approached the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, today, you are going to hear the truth. Not the story that was told 17 years ago. Not the carefully constructed lie that allowed this man to walk free. You are going to hear what really happened the night Anthony Green was murdered. Calloway's lawyer objected immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Prejudicial language. Naomi barely glanced in his direction. Overruled. Proceed. Rachel nodded. The facts of this case are simple. A 17-year-old boy was stopped by Officer Calloway. He was unarmed. He was scared. And he was shot, point blank. The official statement said he reached for his waistband, but new evidence proves that was a lie. And not just a lie, an intentional, deliberate cover-up. She turned, walking to the defense table, her eyes narrowing. Mark Calloway didn't just kill Anthony Green. He silenced a witness. He buried the truth. He walked free while a mother buried her son. But today, that ends. The words cut through the air like a blade. Naomi studied Calloway carefully. His hands remained steady, his expression unreadable, but there was something behind his eyes, a flicker, the briefest shadow of unease. The prosecution called their first witness. A man, older now, but his voice steady. I was there that night, he said, his voice carrying through the room. I saw everything. Anthony had his hands up. He was crying, saying he didn't do anything. And Calloway, he didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. Then he looked at me and said, "You didn't see shit." I was 17, same age as Anthony. And I was scared. He swallowed hard, his gaze locked on Calloway. I stayed scared for 17 years. A murmur spread through the crowd. Naomi let the words settle, the weight of them filling every corner of the room. Calloway's lawyer scrambled to discredit the witness, but the damage was already done. The truth was out. The second witness was even worse for Calloway. A retired officer, someone who had been part of the original investigation. I was told to close the case, he admitted, his voice hollow. Told to make sure it never went anywhere. Calloway had friends in high places. And I was a coward. I didn't push back. I let it happen. Naomi saw Calloway's fingers twitch. His control was slipping, piece by piece, the foundation beneath him cracking. Then it was his turn. The defense called him to the stand, a last-ditch effort to salvage what was left. He stood slowly, walked to the witness box, his every movement measured. He looked at Naomi as he sat down, but for the first time, there was no smirk, no condescension, no certainty. Just silence. The defense attorney started the questioning, keeping it clean, controlled. Sergeant Calloway, did you act in accordance with your training that night? Calloway nodded. Yes. And did you, at any point, intend to harm an innocent person? No. Rachel stood. Sergeant Calloway, let's talk about intent. You said you acted according to your training. Does your training tell you to shoot an unarmed teenager? Calloway hesitated. He matched the description. Did he have a weapon? A pause. No. Did he reach for anything? Calloway's jaw clenched. I thought, you thought. You assumed. And because of that assumption, a boy is dead. And then, instead of admitting your mistake, you covered it up. You threatened a witness. You buried the truth. Why? Silence. Why, Sergeant Calloway? His fingers curled into fists. The tension was suffocating. The room had stopped breathing. Naomi watched him carefully. This was it. The moment he realized there was no escape. Rachel leaned in, her voice low but sharp. Was it because he was black? Calloway's eyes snapped up, anger flashing across his face. That's bullshit. Is it? Rachel pressed. Because I think you saw a scared black kid, and you didn't see a life worth sparing. I think you pulled that trigger because, deep down, you knew you could. Because people like you always get away with it. Calloway's lawyer objected, but Naomi barely registered it. She was watching him, watching the way his mask was slipping, the way his breathing had changed. Rachel wasn't done. Tell me, Sergeant. If he had been a white kid, would you have pulled that trigger? Silence. The courtroom was frozen in time. Calloway's mouth opened, then shut. His throat bobbed. He didn't answer. He couldn't answer. Naomi let the moment stretch, let the weight of his silence settle in. Then she spoke, her voice even, final. No further questions. Calloway sat there, hands shaking, his career, his freedom, his entire life unraveling in front of him. And Naomi Carter sat behind the bench, watching a man who had once refused to stand for her finally realizing, this time, there was nowhere left to run. The silence in the courtroom stretched, thick and suffocating, pressing against the walls, against the breath of every person in the room. Mark Calloway sat rigid in the witness chair, his face pale, his hands gripping the edges of the stand like he could anchor himself there, like he could keep the weight of the truth from dragging him under. But it was too late. The moment had cracked open, and now the whole room could see what he was trying so desperately to hold together. His silence was deafening. More damning than any confession he could have made. More powerful than any defense his attorney could try to spin. He knew it. Naomi knew it. The jury knew it. Rachel stepped back, her expression unreadable, but the fire in her voice still burned in the air. Naomi watched the way Calloway's jaw twitched, the way he swallowed like his throat had gone dry. She had seen men like him in court before, watched them use their uniforms as shields, watched them manipulate the law to twist reality in their favor. But today, for the first time, Calloway had no shield. No protection. He was just a man, exposed, unraveling, drowning in the weight of his own actions. His lawyer cleared his throat, standing stiffly, clearly rattled. "Sergeant Calloway, do you wish to respond?" Calloway exhaled sharply, shaking his head just enough for Naomi to see the flicker of something behind his eyes. Rage? Regret? Fear? Maybe all three. His lawyer tried again. "Sergeant, for the record, did you?" Calloway's voice, when it finally came, was rough, raw. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Naomi felt her fingers tighten against the gavel, felt her pulse slow as she took in the weight of his words. Not a denial. Not an excuse. A crack. The first crack in the wall he had built around himself. Rachel turned back, her expression sharp. "What do you mean, Sergeant? What exactly wasn't supposed to happen?" Calloway's lawyer objected, but Naomi barely glanced at him. "Overruled. Answer the question, Sergeant." Calloway hesitated. His fingers curled against his knee. His shoulders stiffened. He was fighting it, fighting the pull of the truth, the pull of something he had buried for nearly 2 decades. But it was slipping, the ground beneath him shifting, and for the first time in his life, he had nowhere to go. His voice came low, almost a whisper. He ran. He was scared, and he ran. I told him to stop, and he didn't. Rachel's voice didn't waver. "So you shot him?" Calloway's hands clenched. I thought he had something." Naomi's chest tightened, the courtroom so still it felt like time had stopped. Rachel pressed forward. "But he didn't, did he?" Calloway's breath hitched. "No. You shot an unarmed boy." Silence. "You killed an innocent child." Calloway's head dipped slightly. His fingers dug into his knee, white-knuckled. "I didn't think. I reacted." The words were empty, hollow, and Naomi felt the sting of them crawl under her skin. How many times had she heard that same excuse? "I didn't think. I was scared. I just reacted." How many times had black lives been stolen by men who didn't think? Rachel stepped closer, her voice cutting through the thick, stifling air. "And after you reacted, you covered it up, didn't you? You changed your report. You silenced a witness. You lied. You let that boy's mother grieve, let his family believe there would never be justice. And you went on with your life like nothing happened." Calloway's breathing was uneven now, his shoulders rising and falling as if the air had become too heavy. Naomi saw it in his face, the years of unchecked power, the years of knowing he could get away with it, all of it unraveling in real time. Rachel's voice didn't let up. "Why, Mark?" His head snapped up at the sound of his first name, the last piece of control slipping through his fingers. "Why?" Rachel demanded, stepping closer. "Why did you do it?" Calloway exhaled, his voice hoarse. "Because I could." The words fell like a hammer. The courtroom gasped. Naomi felt her pulse in her ears, the weight of that confession settling over the room like a dark cloud. Rachel stared at him, eyes burning. "You thought you'd get away with it." Calloway blinked, but there was nothing left to say. Rachel turned to the jury, her voice steady. "And for 17 years, he did." The impact of those words hit like a tidal wave. Naomi scanned the faces in the jury box, saw the way they absorbed it, saw the way the weight of the truth settled into their bones. Calloway's lawyer stood abruptly. "No further questions, Your Honor." Naomi nodded slowly, glancing toward Calloway, whose face was blank, his hands still curled into fists against his lap. His breathing was uneven, but he wasn't smirking anymore. The arrogance was gone. The control was gone. She looked out into the courtroom, at the people who had been waiting for this moment, at the people who had never stopped fighting for Anthony Green, for all the others like him whose names had been buried beneath statistics and excuses. She had spent her life believing in justice, believing in the law, and now, for the first time in a long time, she felt it. Her voice was firm, final. Court is adjourned. As the gavel struck the wood, the room exhaled, and the weight of 17 years shattered into something new. The past had caught up to Mark Calloway. And this time, justice wasn't letting go. The echoes of the gavel still lingered in the air, but the tension in the courtroom did not break. It stretched, pulled tight like a rope about to snap, as the weight of what had just happened settled onto the shoulders of every person present. The air was thick with a kind of stunned silence, the kind that follows something too significant to process all at once. The jurors were still seated, unmoving, their faces pale as they absorbed the confession that had just unfolded before them. The reporters clutched their pens, their hands frozen above notepads, minds struggling to keep up with the reality that had just crashed down onto this courtroom. The audience, some of them family members of past victims, some of them activists who had spent years demanding accountability, sat in a daze, as if they couldn't believe they had actually witnessed this moment. And at the center of it all sat Mark Calloway. His fingers were still clenched around the edge of the witness stand, knuckles pale, the tendons in his hands pulled so tight it looked as if he might crush the wood beneath them. His head was lowered, shoulders hunched as if he could shrink himself into nothingness. But there was nowhere to hide. Not anymore. His world had caved in around him, and for the first time in his life, there was no system in place to protect him, no badge to shield him from the consequences of his actions. He had spent years walking through life untouchable, believing himself above reproach, above punishment. And now, he was just another man stripped of his defenses, exposed before the very law he had manipulated for decades. The bailiff finally stepped forward. The moment had arrived. The moment Calloway had never imagined would come. "Mark Calloway, please stand." The irony was suffocating. He had refused to stand for Naomi Carter when she had entered this courtroom days ago, a show of blatant defiance, of deep-seated arrogance. And now, the system he had once weaponized against others was demanding he stand for it. But there was no smirk on his face this time. No trace of the smug superiority he had worn like armor. Only resignation. Slowly, his legs shifted, unsteady, as if the very act of rising required effort. His movements were reluctant, drained of the confidence he had once carried so effortlessly. Naomi watched him closely, her hands clasped together on the bench in front of her, her face unreadable. The power dynamic had shifted in ways he had never imagined possible. Once, he had sat at the top of the hierarchy, looking down on people like her, dismissing their worth, their place in the world. Now, he stood before her, stripped of the privilege that had shielded him for so long. His attorney placed a hesitant hand on his shoulder, but Calloway shrugged it off, as if any attempt at reassurance was pointless. He turned his gaze toward the jury, those 12 faces that now held his fate in their hands. Some of them couldn't meet his eyes. Others stared back at him with quiet condemnation, with the weight of everything they had just witnessed pressing into their expressions. The prosecution had finished its work. The evidence had been laid bare. The lies had been unraveled. The jury had all the information they needed to deliberate. But Calloway knew, he knew, there was nothing left to argue. His own voice had condemned him. His lawyer, sweat beading along his forehead, turned toward Naomi. "Your Honor, given the gravity of today's revelations, would like to request that my client be allowed to remain free on bail until sentencing." The courtroom erupted. A wave of voices, anger, disbelief. A man in the back scoffed loudly, shaking his head. Someone else muttered, "Unbelievable." Naomi could hear the whispered voices of Anthony Green's family, seated in the second row, his mother's breath hitching in disbelief. Naomi let the noise settle, her face carefully impassive as she looked directly at Calloway. He did not look at her. "Bail is denied," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. "Given the severity of the charges, the nature of the crime, and the risk of flight, the defendant will be taken into custody immediately." The words landed with finality, sealing the fate that Calloway had spent his entire career believing would never come for him. The bailiff stepped forward, a pair of handcuffs gleaming in his grip. The last shield of his privilege cracked apart, the illusion of invincibility finally shattered. Calloway's breaths came unevenly. His shoulders stiffened. He turned, facing the inevitable as his wrists were pulled behind him, the cold steel clicking shut around them. For years, he had placed these same handcuffs on others, never once considering that one day they would be placed on him. Anthony Green's mother exhaled, slow, controlled, gripping the hands of the family members seated beside her. Her eyes did not leave Calloway. She had waited for this moment for 17 years. It had come at an unthinkable cost, but it had come. As Calloway was led away, the silence in the room was almost unbearable. Naomi let it stretch for a long moment, let everyone absorb the reality of what had just happened. This case, this trial, it had been about more than just one man's crimes. It had been about history, about power, about justice that had been denied for too long. Finally, she turned toward the jury. You are dismissed for deliberation. The court will reconvene once you have reached a verdict. The jurors stood, moving slowly, still processing everything that had unfolded before them. They would weigh the evidence, they would determine the legal outcome of Calloway's crimes, but Naomi already knew. His fate had been decided the moment his own voice had betrayed him. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Naomi allowed herself a single deep breath. The fight wasn't over. Justice was a slow-moving force, often frustrating, often incomplete. But today, it had taken a step forward. And when the verdict came, it would echo far beyond this courtroom. The hours passed in slow, tense silence as the jury deliberated. The courtroom had emptied, leaving behind only the shadows of what had just unfolded. Naomi remained in her chambers, the door closed, the heavy weight of her gavel resting beside the case file that had led them all here. The room was quiet, but her mind was not. The echoes of the trial still lingered, Calloway's confession, the way his voice had cracked, the stunned silence that followed. It was over, at least in the sense that the truth had been laid bare. But justice was never simple, never as clean as people wanted to believe. A confession wasn't enough. The system still had to decide what it would do with him. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Lisa stepped in, her usual composed demeanor slightly frayed at the edges. They've reached a verdict, she said, voice careful, measured, as if unwilling to disturb the fragile air in the room. Naomi exhaled, nodding. That was fast. Lisa hesitated before responding. I don't think they needed much time to decide. Naomi rose, smoothing the front of her robe, letting her hands press against the fabric just long enough to ground herself. No matter how many cases she had presided over, no matter how many verdicts she had announced, there was always a moment just before stepping back into the courtroom that felt like standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. As she walked through the hall, her step steady, purposeful, the noise from inside the courtroom grew louder. The crowd had returned, waiting, buzzing with unspoken anticipation. Reporters whispered to one another, cameras at the ready, eyes fixed on the doors as if expecting them to swing open with history itself on the other side. The families sat together, Anthony Green's mother gripping the hands of those beside her, her breath shallow, her eyes locked forward. She had waited years for this. Naomi could feel it in the way she sat, perfectly still, bracing herself for whatever would come next. When Naomi stepped through the doors, the room fell into a hush. The jurors were already seated, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and certainty. They had made their choice. Naomi took her seat at the bench, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom before landing on the jury foreman, a middle-aged black man with careful eyes. Has the jury reached a verdict? He stood, clearing his throat before reading from the paper in his hands. We have, Your Honor. The room tensed. Every breath held. Every muscle tight. Naomi gave a slow nod. Please read the verdict. The foreman inhaled, steadying himself. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. On the charge of perjury, guilty. The tension climbed, a wave building, growing, pressing against the walls. And on the charge of murder in the first degree, he paused, just for a breath, just long enough for everyone to feel the weight of it pressing into their ribs. Guilty. The room erupted. Some gasped, some whispered, others simply sat in stunned silence, letting the words settle into their bones. A verdict like this, against a cop, against someone who had spent years believing himself untouchable, was almost unheard of. Calloway didn't react at first. He just sat there, staring ahead, his face blank, his hands clasped together on the table in front of him. Then, slowly, he exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening as reality crashed into him like a tidal wave. His lawyer stood, scrambling, already preparing an appeal. "Your Honor, we request immediate post-trial relief. My client has a right to appeal." Naomi lifted a hand, silencing him before he could continue. "Your client will have the opportunity to appeal in due process," she said, her voice even, firm. "But for now, he will remain in custody until sentencing." Calloway's shoulders stiffened. His fingers twitched slightly, as if resisting the urge to grip the table harder. Naomi turned her gaze to him, holding it there for a long moment. "Mark Calloway, you have been found guilty on all charges. You will be remanded to the custody of the state pending sentencing. Court is adjourned." The gavel struck wood, sealing his fate. The room exhaled all at once. Anthony Green's mother broke, her shoulders shaking, her face buried in her hands. The people around her reached for her, holding on to her, supporting her, as if they had been holding their breath for 17 years and had only now been given permission to release it. Naomi watched Calloway as the bailiff stepped forward, as the weight of the verdict settled onto him. For the first time, he looked small. The arrogance, the smugness, the untouchable confidence, gone. Just a man facing the consequences of what he had done. As he was led away, he turned, just slightly, looking at Naomi for the first time since the trial had begun. There was something in his eyes, not quite defiance, but not quite regret either. Something in between. Something that spoke of a man who had never truly considered the idea that justice could turn against him. But it had. And now, there was no escaping it. The courtroom emptied slowly, the buzz of voices still lingering in the air. Naomi remained seated for a moment, allowing herself to absorb the weight of what had just happened. This was justice, or at least the closest thing to it that she had ever seen. It would never be enough, not for Anthony's family, not for the countless others who had never seen a guilty verdict read for their sons, their daughters, their loved ones. But it was something. Lisa approached, hesitant. "You okay?" Naomi exhaled, standing, feeling the tension in her muscles begin to ease. "I don't know," she admitted. "But today, for the first time in a long time, I think the system actually worked." Lisa nodded. "It did." Naomi glanced toward the door where Calloway had been led out, disappearing into a future he had never expected. Then, with one last look at the emptying courtroom, she turned and walked away, knowing that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than one man's downfall. This was a shift. And if she had anything to do with it, it would not be the last. The halls of the courthouse felt strangely empty after the verdict, as if the weight of the trial had drained the very life out of the building. Naomi Carter walked through the corridor, her footsteps echoing against the polished floors, her mind still processing everything that had unfolded in that courtroom. The gavel had fallen, the decision had been made, and yet the reality of what had just happened hadn't fully settled. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another trial. It was a shift, one that had taken years to arrive, one that had almost never happened at all. Lisa walked beside her, her hands clasped around a tablet, though she wasn't really looking at it. Her usual efficiency had been replaced with something else, something thoughtful, hesitant. Naomi could feel the question before Lisa even voiced it. "You think this is really over?" Lisa finally asked, her voice low, cautious. Naomi exhaled slowly, stopping just outside her chambers. For Calloway? No. There will be appeals, legal maneuvering, all of it. His defense team will throw everything they have at this. But the verdict? That stands. Lisa nodded, shifting slightly on her feet. And for you? Naomi glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her expression. What do you mean? Lisa sighed. Come on, Naomi. You know what I mean. This was big. The kind of case that gets talked about for years. You were at the center of it. You are at the center of it. You think people are just gonna let that go? Naomi didn't answer immediately. She had spent her entire career in spaces where people like her were never truly welcome, never truly accepted. Being a black woman in law, let alone a judge, meant walking a tightrope at all times, never appearing too emotional, never seeming too rigid, never giving anyone a reason to doubt that she belonged in the seat she had earned. And this case? This case had cracked something open. I didn't do this to make history, Naomi said finally. I did it because it was the right thing to do. That's it. Lisa gave a small, knowing smile. Maybe. But history doesn't care about your intentions. You just became part of it, whether you wanted to or not. Naomi let that sit between them for a moment. She wasn't naive. The backlash was coming. The people who had seen Calloway as a hero, the ones who had spent years dismissing cases like Anthony Green's as tragedies, instead of what they really were, injustices, they would be furious. They would call this trial a sham, say Calloway was being persecuted, that the system had turned against good cops. The irony of it all was almost laughable. Before she could say anything else, the door to her chambers opened, and a voice interrupted the quiet. Judge Carter, may I have a word? Naomi turned to see Marcia Green, Anthony's mother, standing in the doorway. Her posture was stiff, her hands wrung together as if she didn't quite know what to do with them. Her face, lined with years of grief and exhaustion, was unreadable. Naomi had seen that look before, in too many mothers' faces, the weight of waiting for justice, the ache of knowing that no verdict could ever truly make up for what had been taken. Naomi nodded, stepping aside, motioning for her to come in. Lisa gave a quick glance between them before taking a step back, understanding this was a conversation that wasn't meant to be interrupted. Once the door closed, Marcia exhaled, a long breath that seemed to carry the weight of the past 17 years. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she just looked at Naomi, as if trying to find the words that would make sense of all of this. Naomi gestured toward the chair across from her desk. Please, have a seat. Marcia hesitated before lowering herself slowly into the chair, folding her hands in her lap. Her fingers twisted around each other, the only sign of the nerve she was trying to suppress. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel right now, she admitted, her voice raw, almost fragile. Naomi sat across from her, her hands clasped together on the desk. You don't have to know. There's no right way to feel about something like this. Marcia let out a short, almost bitter laugh. I thought I would feel relief. Or peace. Or something. But all I can think about is how this doesn't change the fact that my son is still gone. That I still wake up every day knowing I'll never hear his voice again. That no matter how many years Calloway spends in a cell, Anthony isn't coming back. Naomi felt a deep, aching pull in her chest. Justice and closure aren't the same thing. One doesn't erase the need for the other. Marcia nodded slowly, looking down at her hands. I spent 17 years asking why. 17 years wondering how a man could take my child from me and just walk away like it meant nothing. I thought that maybe, in that courtroom, I would finally understand. But when I looked at him, when I heard him speak, all I saw was emptiness. He didn't even regret it. He just regretted getting caught. Naomi didn't respond immediately. There was nothing she could say to undo what had been done, nothing that could make this loss less cruel. She had spent her entire career fighting for moments like this, moments where the law actually held people accountable, but she knew accountability was not the same as healing. "You did everything right," Marcia said suddenly, her voice stronger now. "You didn't let him get away with it. And I know there are people out there who will come after you for it. Who will say you overstepped, that this was about politics, not justice. But I want you to know that none of that matters to me. Because for the first time in 17 years, my son's name wasn't just another headline people forgot about after a week. For the first time, someone made sure his name meant something." Naomi felt her throat tighten, but she kept her expression steady. His name always meant something. This case didn't change that. Marcia exhaled, nodding. "I just wanted to say thank you. Before this, I didn't believe this system was capable of justice for people like my son. And maybe I still don't, not completely. But today, you proved that sometimes, it can be." Naomi met her gaze, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Some things didn't require words. Finally, Marcia stood, her movement slow, deliberate. Naomi rose with her, and as Marcia turned toward the door, she hesitated. Then, in a movement that seemed almost instinctual, she reached forward and took Naomi's hand, squeezing it once, firm but brief, before letting go. Then she was gone. Naomi sat back down, her hands pressed together, her eyes lingering on the space where Marcia had just stood. The sound of the door shutting behind her felt final, but she knew better than to believe in endings. This wasn't the end. This was only another step in a fight that was far from over. She glanced down at the desk, at the folder that still lay open, filled with papers that told a story she had now helped rewrite. Calloway was gone, but there were more like him, more cases, more names that had never seen justice. And she wasn't done. Not yet. The day of sentencing arrived, and the weight of it could be felt in every corner of the courtroom. The air was thick with anticipation, a tension that had settled into the bones of everyone present. Naomi sat at the bench, poised, composed, her expression unreadable. Across from her, Mark Calloway stood between two officers, his hands cuffed in front of him, his suit hanging loose on his frame. He looked smaller now, the arrogance that once defined him stripped away, leaving behind a man who had spent the past weeks in a cell, forced to face a reality he had never imagined for himself. His eyes darted toward the jury box, then to the rows of spectators, activists, reporters, fellow officers who had once stood by his side but now sat in silence. There were no supporters left. No protests outside demanding his freedom. Just the crushing solitude of his downfall. Naomi turned to the prosecutor. "Does the state have a final statement before sentencing?" Rachel Lawson rose from her seat, her gaze steady as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, the prosecution has nothing further to add. The facts of this case speak for themselves. The jury has found the defendant guilty of murder, obstruction of justice, and perjury. The victim, Anthony Green, was only 17 years old. He had no weapon. He had no chance. The state requests the maximum sentence under the law." Calloway's attorney, visibly exhausted from weeks of futile attempts to save his client, hesitated before standing. "Your Honor, while my client maintains that this was a tragic mistake, we ask the court to consider his years of service, his contributions to law enforcement, and his family. We request leniency in sentencing." Naomi let the words settle, her gaze flickering toward Calloway. He remained silent, offering no plea, no final defense. He knew there was nothing left to say. She exhaled, steadying herself before speaking. "Mark Calloway, you took an oath to serve and protect, but instead, you used your badge to take a life, to silence a witness, and to cover up the truth. The jury has spoken, and now this court will do the same. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Some people exhaled in relief. Others nodded solemnly. Calloway's face remained impassive, but his hands trembled slightly as the officers moved to take him away. For the first time, the finality of it all seemed to register in his expression. He had lived his entire life believing that consequences were for other people. But now, he was just another convicted murderer, a cautionary tale. As the courtroom emptied, Naomi remained seated, allowing herself a rare moment of stillness. She watched as Anthony Green's mother stood at the back of the room, her hands clasped together, eyes closed, as if absorbing the weight of what had just happened. Then, slowly, she turned and walked out, her back straight, her step steady. She had spent 17 years waiting for justice, and now, she could finally breathe. Weeks passed, and life continued, but the trial's impact did not fade. Naomi received letters, emails, calls, some filled with gratitude, others with anger. She knew the backlash would come. She knew there would be those who saw this as an attack, who believed Calloway had been made an example of. But she also knew the truth. Justice had to start somewhere. The fight for accountability, for fairness, for change, could not be won in one case alone. But this was a step. A necessary, overdue step. One evening, as she packed up her office, Lisa knocked on the door. "You have a visitor," she said, her tone softer than usual. Naomi looked up, slightly surprised. "Who is it?" Lisa hesitated. "One of Anthony Green's old friends. He asked to see you." Naomi nodded, motioning for her to let him in. The young man entered, nervous but determined, his hands tucked into his pockets. He introduced himself, David Carter, one of Anthony's childhood friends. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "For not letting people forget. For making sure his name meant something. When we were kids, we used to talk about what we wanted to be when we grew up. Anthony wanted to be a lawyer. He wanted to help people. I used to tell him he was crazy, that the system wasn't built for us. But seeing what you did, what you fought for, it makes me think maybe he wasn't crazy after all." Naomi felt something tighten in her chest. "He wasn't," she said softly. "And neither are you." David nodded, exhaling slowly. "I'm applying to law school. I want to do what he never got the chance to." Naomi's breath caught slightly, but she nodded, a small, steady smile forming. "Then do it. And when you get there, don't let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." David smiled back, a quiet but unshakable determination in his eyes. "I won't." As he left, Naomi leaned back in her chair, letting the moment settle. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But maybe, just maybe, this was what progress looked like. And as long as she had a gavel in her hand, she would make sure that progress never stopped. Now, I want to hear from you. What did this story make you feel? Did you expect this ending? Do you believe justice was truly served? Let me know in the comments, I want to hear your thoughts. And if you want more stories like this, ones that make you think, make you feel, make you question everything, subscribe to Tales of Twist and turn on your notifications. There's always another story waiting to be told.